It is Friday, and we are working for Crusoe. Friday, June 27th, 2025 in Los Angeles. He is Sam Park. In Los Angeles, I am John Ramey, and let's get right to it, Sam. This is from Wikipedia. On June 22nd, 5 days ago, the United States Air Force and Navy attacked 3 nuclear facilities in Iran as part of the Iran-Israel war. The Fordo uranium enrichment plant, the Natanz nuclear facility, and the Isfahan Nuclear Technology Center were targeted with 14 30,000-pound bunker buster bombs carried by B-2 Spirit stealth bombers and with Tomahawk missiles fired from a submarine. The attack, which was given the codename Operation Midnight Hammer, was the United States' first offensive action in the Iran-Israel war, which began on June 13th with surprise Israeli strikes. We'll throw up a graphic here to show the sites that were struck by the U.S. within Iran. So since then, 5 days ago, there are any number of things to discuss, Sam. Today, Donald Trump, the president, told ABC News he would bomb Iran again, quote, without a question, if intelligence were to find that Iran can't enrich uranium to a level higher than what he is comfortable with. BBC reporting that Iran's foreign minister has admitted excessive and serious damage was done to the country's nuclear sites in the recent U.S. and Israeli bombings. CNN reporting Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz says he's instructed the military to prepare for an, quote, enforcement plan against Iran following the 12-day conflict. The New York Times has some great reporting about an 880-pound stockpile of uranium that was enriched to 60% by the Iranians. You need 90% for a nuclear weapon. There is concern that nobody knows where this is, and now Republicans in the United States, after being briefed by the administration, are saying, well, the stockpile wasn't the target. So we have a little bit of moving goalposts from those who are defending the Trump administration's decision to bomb Iran. Iran has executed 3 men convicted of spying for Israel. There's kind of a dragnet, a paranoid dragnet going on in Iran right now. There are any number of handles upon which we can grab this story, Sam. So I'll let you kind of decide. Okay.
Well, just in brief, I have 3 main things to say about this story, but only one of them, that the last one that I will list, has any necessity of being discussed in any detail. So the first one is that this entire operation, now, mind you, I'm not an attorney. All of my knowledge of the law plus a couple bucks will get you a cup of coffee, right? But this whole thing's illegal, all right? And so I just want to make sure that we mention that before we go any further. That's point one. Point two is that none of this would have happened last weekend had Donald Trump, then President of the United States, and once again President of the United States, not pulled out of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action back in, I guess it was 2018.
The Iran nuclear deal.
Yes, we have colloquially known as the Iran nuclear deal, signed by President Obama amongst several nations, including Iran, back in, I believe that was 2015. And the JCPOA, as it's known, gave us an unprecedented and as yet unmatched level of visibility into Iran's nuclear energy program. Now, it wasn't complete visibility. Iran was probably cheating on the strictures outlined in the JCPOA during that time. But there's been no remotely comparable level of visibility into their nuclear activities since then. So that's point two. And again, this is, I would imagine anyway, uncontroversial. I don't think there's any need to discuss that any further, which brings me to my final point, which I think merits some further discussion, which is that considering everything that happened from, during the entire lead up to and the actual military involvement of the United States last Saturday, and the people actually involved in this entire process, I think this might have actually ended up about as well as we can possibly imagine, mainly because we got a ceasefire very quickly afterwards. And for that and several other reasons, I think, as much as it pains me to say so, this is a win for Donald Trump. And so that is the not the sum total, but the sort of back of the envelope list of the things that I've got to talk about today. But I would be very, very anxious to hear what you might think, John.
Well, again, there has already been kind of a race to the narrative here in the United States about whether the attacks were successful. The administration made an announcement. Donald Trump, flanked by his senior cabinet members right after the attack, said that Iran's nuclear capabilities were completely obliterated. But then today we have Republican senators saying, well, the 880-pound uranium stockpile wasn't even a target. So those two things cannot both be true at the same time.
That's right. But I think that's absolutely right. And now the problem that I've been having in the past couple of days is that, as you say, there's this sort of competition of narratives about to what extent the Iranian nuclear program has been damaged by these attacks. And the only point that I would like to make about that, and I really think the only point that anybody ought to make about it, is that this is what the late former Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, whom I'm generally loath to quote, right, but would have memorably described as a known unknown, right? This is something that we know we do not know. And that's all that anybody actually should be saying about this. I don't think the Iranians today even know the full extent of the damage that's been done to their program. And so we're basically involved in a kind of pissing match between the Trump administration, including but not limited to the president himself and his defense secretary, Pete Hegseth, and the media, right? And now it's the media's job to ask these sorts of questions, but that's not the entirety of their job. They're the people back at the anchor desk and sitting around the innumerable commentary tables have the job of saying what I've just said about Donald Rumsfeld, all right? And just sort of moving on from this, which I think we're probably about to do, and I'm happy for that. But there's no point in actually discussing the extent to which the Iranian nuclear program has been damaged. I would say, though, that extent is not zero, right? Everybody agrees for their own individual reasons that there has been some level of damage to the program. And I think that we could just stipulate that and move on.
Okay, so the latest on that, just for continuity's sake, the BBC reporting, Iran's foreign minister has admitted that, quote, excessive and serious damage was done to the country's nuclear sites in the recent U.S. and Israeli bombings. Abbas Araghchi, told a state broadcaster Thursday night, that's last night, that an assessment of the damage is being carried out by the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran. But just hours earlier, Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, said the strikes did not disrupt the country's nuclear program. Khamenei was responding to U.S. President Donald Trump's assertions that the bombs had, quote, totally obliterated 3 nuclear sites. Khamenei said the U.S. attacks had failed to, quote, accomplish anything significant. So you have, again, I know we'll move on from this, but let's be cognizant of, you have 2 narratives. You have the hyperbolic / propagandistic narrative that is unfortunately coming not only from the Iranians, from whom we might expect it, but also the United States administration.
From whom we should also expect it.
Right. Well, unfortunately, we should expect it. Right. And then you have kind of the experts, including the Iranian Atomic Energy Organization, as well as various other nuclear watchdogs and intelligence services throughout the world, who are correctly saying this is going to take a minute to figure out. So I just wanted to make sure we're very clear about that. And so we can kind of ignore the 2 blustering supreme leaders.
Yes.
Okay.
And in fact, ought to do so.
Right. Now, whether this worked or not, as you pointed out, doesn't negate the fact that the Israeli and the American strikes on Iran were illegal by international law. We need to also remind folks that there was no UN resolution. There was no authorization of force. These were unilateral decisions made by two countries in concert to make war on another country. Whether you think Iran should have a nuclear weapon, should have a nuclear program of any kind, it was illegal. Okay, so now let's get to Israel. CNN reporting. Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz says he's instructed the military to prepare an, quote, enforcement plan against Iran following the 12-day conflict, which saw Israel kill military targets and pound Iran's nuclear sites. In a post on Twitter today, Katz said the plan would include, quote, maintaining Israel's air superiority, preventing nuclear and missile development, and responding to Iranian support for terrorist activity, end of quote. Katz described the Israeli operations against Iran as, quote, 12 days of brilliant action, end of quote, that eliminated Iranian air defenses and destroyed its missile production. Quote, we eliminated senior security officials and leading scientists advancing the nuclear program, he said. Katz ended his post. A word of caution to the toothless serpent's head in Tehran. Operation Rising Lion, that's the name of the Israeli operation against Iran, was only the preview of a new Israeli policy. After October 7th, immunity is over. Now, we are generally not pro-war on this podcast, and I think we have taken a very measured approach to assessing Israel's response to October 7th, specifically regarding the crimes against humanity in Gaza. If we take Gaza out of the discussion and just view the action against Iran by Israel through the lens of October 7th, I am hard-pressed to find this not defensible, except for the illegality. But as far as, like, Hamas is an Iranian client, Hamas did terrible things, couldn't have done it without the help of Iran. Iran's fundamentalist, theocratic leadership says death to Israel every third breath. Like, it's defensible.
No, it's not. At all.
Okay.
Not remotely.
Tell me more.
I mean, okay,
I'm saying after October 7th.
Did Iran have a nuclear weapon?
No.
No, they didn't. Now,
I'm not. Let's just say a strike to
then
degrade
how is it
Iranian
defensible?
Military. Because let's just say, in a broader lens, it's a strike to degrade Iranian military capability.
Okay. Iran, until I guess it was last year, had never attacked Israel. They say things all the time. And if we're going to hold countries accountable preemptively for threats they make to other people, where does that end? All right?
I guess Greenland would have to bomb us.
But yeah, by that logic, all right, we should have, there should have been military intervention against Israel by any number of people over and over again. And so I just don't understand how this sort of case can be made. But this is all theoretical, right? Now, the point is that if we just take this argument at face value, right, then it's all about eliminating the threat to Israel from Iran, okay? But we can look at other things that Defense Minister Katz has said, right? He has said that Ayatollah Ali Khamenei should not be allowed to continue to exist, right? He's, as far as I know, the Israeli official who's come closest to openly advocating for regime change in Iran. And many, I mean, at least numerous other Israeli officials have sort of not gone quite as far as Defense Minister Katz, in that regard. But I think it's rather clear that Israel has been pursuing a not quite explicitly spoken policy of regime change all the way through this campaign, that is over the past couple of weeks. For instance, they didn't just take out the nuclear program, right? Earlier, last week, that is, they bombed the state broadcaster. Now, this is a sort of almost North Korean style propaganda outlet, right? It's not like it's the BBC or something, okay? But it has nothing to do with the nuclear program, all right? The state broadcaster isn't any sort of threat to Israel, or at least it doesn't make sense to bomb them if you're trying to eliminate a military threat. It makes quite a lot of sense to bomb them if you're trying to change the regime. And this is not the only target that Israel has pursued since these hostilities ramped up in the past couple of weeks. And so, and that leads me back to the point I was making at the top of the show, right? Is that we can take some relief in the idea that President Trump, in spite of the illegality of this attack against Iran's nuclear facilities last weekend, seems rather disinclined to follow the Israelis down the path of regime change. And I would say with good reason. In fact, we're hearing much less about regime change, even from the Israelis, than we heard last week. And I just want to link this back up to this whole sort of hyperbolic dialogue of narratives, right? The whole position of the Trump administration since the attacks has been essentially, this is over.
Right.
Right? In other words, we don't want to go further.
It's been as clear and as consistent a message as Trump has maybe had in his entire presidency, either term.
That's right. And at one point, it seemed as though Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel was sort of maneuvering Trump gradually into pursuing whatever policy Netanyahu wanted to enact. And it seems as though Trump has sort of boxed him out, at least for the moment, and said, no, we're not going to overthrow the Iranian regime. And so last week, our listeners, I'm sure, recall that I thought at that point, the most likely scenario was something like the Libya example, in which the dictator was overthrown and the nation was plunged into more than a decade, and about almost a decade and a half now, of warring factions struggling for control, which is still where Libya is at today. Now, since last weekend, it seems as though we're looking at something more like Iraq in the 90s, right? In which the dictatorial government is still in place, but severely weakened and much less of a threat to their immediate neighborhood. Now, I think that is just sort of the best analogy I can come up with right now. And I was interested to hear a Qatari professor appearing on Al Jazeera earlier this week, and his name was Mohammed Saloom. He teaches at whatever university in Doha, but he essentially outlined this same scenario. So it's nice to have someone who knows about these things more than I do, confirming the thing that I already thought just for myself.
Speaking of historical, oh, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, if we're searching for analogies, when it seemed, especially earlier this week, that it was Netanyahu kind of leading, kind of drawing Trump and therefore the United States military into this conflict, it would make Netanyahu the Franz Josef of Austria-Hungary, and it would make Trump Wilhelm II. Yeah. Which didn't end well. Spoiler alert.
And I think, I don't think...
But Trump has not issued a blank check.
No, exactly right. And we should be happy that he has not done so. But as you mentioned at the top, he's reserved his right to continue bombing Iran whenever he feels like it, right? And so this story is certainly not over, right? Or probably not over, I should say, right? It's possible, and I think that mainly when Trump says that obliterated and things such as this, I think essentially what he's saying is that I don't think this is going to be a big problem for me for the rest of my term. And I think that's probably a pretty good bet. Not overwhelmingly good. I think that's probably maybe a 55% likelihood, but I think he's probably right.
Okay, Iran, as Senator Ted Cruz knows, is a country of 92 million people.
Well, he knows now, yeah.
Yeah. We discussed in previous episodes why regime change is a bad goal. We know from sadly rather recent history that regime change is terrible, even when it's a terrible regime, right? And I know you talked about Israel operating just on threats and how that is not a credible casus belli. But what if you take into consideration this Iranian regime has been waging a proxy war against Israel for decades?
Okay, how's that working out?
How's it working out for whom?
For anybody, right? I mean, the fact is that Israel is one of the safest and most prosperous countries in the world. Israel
is it one of the safest countries in the world, Sam?
It really is, yes. And Israel has almost completely wiped out all of Iran's proxy forces in the region. And so the idea that
so it's gilding the lily to then try to topple the
yes, I would say so.
Regime.
Not just that, but as we've discussed many times, October 7th didn't have to happen were it not for entirely political decisions made by the Netanyahu government. All right. Yes, there was a threat from Hamas, just as there had always been. Netanyahu's government took their eye off of that threat because of their ongoing intention to colonize the West Bank, which, by the way, is seeing record levels of violence right now, committed by settlers and Israeli troops against the Palestinian residents of the West Bank. Right now.
Right. The illegal settlements.
Yes.
Okay. Iran has executed 3 men convicted of spying for Israel, this is Time magazine, and detained hundreds more civilians in a widening crackdown that rights groups say reflects a growing paranoia within the Islamic Republic's leadership following a deadly exchange of strikes with Israel. The executions carried out by hanging targeted Idris Ali, Azad Shajai, and Rasul Ahmad Rasul, ethnic Kurds accused of aiding the Israeli Mossad in the 2020 assassination of Moshe Fakhrizadeh, a prominent nuclear scientist. The names of the executed had previously appeared on a list published by Iran Human Rights, an Oslo-based advocacy group, which warned that at least 10 men faced imminent execution on similar charges. The timing of the executions appears intended less to inflame anti-Israel sentiment than to project strength internally, a source familiar with the matter told Time, describing it as a signal of resolve by a government increasingly consumed with fears of infiltration. It's pretty brutal, but that's pretty on brand for the Islamic Republic.
Well, sure, but it's a sort of expansion of the brand of Israeli intelligence. One of the things that we've learned since the outbreak of hostilities is not exactly, but approximately how extensive Israel's intelligence operations inside of Iran are. And I think this surprised many people. I was certainly surprised.
Sure.
Right? They couldn't have done all the things that they were doing. They weren't just bombing Iran. They were launching sabotage drone attacks and other sorts of sabotage activities inside of Iran with help from people inside of the country. Now, perhaps the 3 men you mentioned who've just been executed and others who might be, maybe they weren't involved at all, but somebody was. And that, again, just reinforces the point that I was making, right? If Israel has this sort of network operating inside of Iran, then they've already gone very far towards neutralizing the threat of Iran. Now, I don't think that Israel has any ability or even intention of occupying Iran, right? That's why I thought the Libya example was the best example. I didn't think they were going to send troops, and I don't think that, even in his wildest dreams, I don't think Netanyahu thought that he could persuade Trump to have American troops occupy Iran, all right? Again, that's why I thought he would just settle for regime collapse. But the point I'm making is that Iran is, I think, more degraded than we understand.
Well, Trump has really been reinforcing that in his rhetoric.
That how degraded they are?
And just how exhausted, I believe, was his term.
Yeah. And I think and again, his interest is in saying that this is over. All right. Now, Israel is sort of throwing him a bone by saying, okay, yeah, we've really done a lot of damage, right? But they're still, as you mentioned, right, Defense Minister Katz, right, is still outlining all of these additional steps that they might
enforcement plan
take.
Right.
Yes. And so there's sort of gradations. But Iran, Israel, and the United States all agree that there's been a lot of damage done. It's in all of their interests for different reasons to say this. But another thing that I think bears mentioning here is that Iran, within some number of years, we don't know what that number is, right, is going to undergo some form of regime change no matter what, if only because the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei is 86 years old. Until yesterday, he had not been heard from since, I think, even before the American attacks last Saturday. And it wasn't certain that he was even still alive. And so he won't live forever. And when he's gone, it's not clear to me that the Iranian regime will maintain the exact same character. I just don't see that it could. Not just because he's so old and wields such immense power inside of the system, but because he's been in sole charge for 36 years. And you can't have someone stay in power that long and then die and expect that everything's going to remain the same under the next person. It just never works out that way.
And I'm just having this thought right now, in perhaps the deepest irony imaginable. Trump not giving Israel the regime change they maybe want, and then this kind of, I guess, gradual regime change or less turbulent regime change that time will take care of anyway at some point, is more in Israel's interests than any military overthrow of the Iranian regime would produce.
It's certainly more in the United States' interest.
But even Israel, right? If you topple this regime, you could get the Iranian iteration of ISIS. You could get something even crazier.
Exactly.
Chaos in a country of 92 million people that's not so far from you, that does have some nuclear capability and a lot of people that hate you, right? If, as you say, the Israelis sit tight with a degraded Iran and the state intact, that's actually probably safer for them.
It might be, right? The problem, though, is that...
Or, hey, let's say you have a maintenance bombing every 18 months or whatever.
Yeah,
that's terrible, but like that's better than 92 million people in a state of civil war.
Okay, the problem is that whatever comes after Khamenei might actually be worse, right? The Shah of Iran was awful, right? But I really do believe that the theocratic regime that succeeded him is much worse, right? And so...
Well, it's certainly much worse for the United States and its allies.
I think it's probably worse than for the Iranian people themselves. It's not my position to say that. That's just a personal opinion that isn't well grounded. Let me just put it that way, right? But the point is,
women could drive under the Shah. I think that's fair.
Sure. The point I'm making is that we don't know what will follow. and we shouldn't assume that it will be an improvement. I think a number of the more knowledgeable
but
commentators.
At least the state, there would be some infrastructure for that change, right? It wouldn't be absolute anarchy.
But well, okay, it still could be, all right. But it does. You're right. It doesn't necessarily have to be, right? But I think that speculating that far out, again, that's another known unknown, all right? And we should just be able to say that and leave it there, right? Instead of going, well, this could be blah, blah, blah. And it's just, it's really just much more honest for us to say we don't know. And so why can't we just do that?
Is this World War III, Sam?
So far, it's not. No. But keep in mind that World War I didn't start for months until after the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And so it could still turn into World War III. But that's why I said at the top, right, that this probably did go about as well as we might expect. And it feels very strange to say that. But I really do believe that's the case. And the more time people spend talking about, well, what does obliteration mean? And it is important that we don't know what happened to the enriched uranium. I think that's the most important outstanding question, right? But the more time we spend talking about these things, the less time we're spending talking about the ongoing depredations of American society under Donald Trump's presidency. Now, that's not generally a topic for our podcast. I'm not talking about ourselves as much as I'm talking about the general media environment. Thankfully, well, not thankfully, but because of today's Supreme Court decision, we'll be returning to domestic matters, I think, in very short order. But that's not for our podcast. That's for our so-called peers in the media environment.
Do you have anything else to add, Sam? Because this will be our last podcast for a couple of weeks. I'm going on holiday.
I think that we've done a creditable job, and there will be many things. I'm sure we'll be returning to this topic, although possibly in less detail than we might have expected. But there will be a number of things that will happen by the time we come back. The July 9th deadline for the reciprocal tariff reintroduction will have passed by that time. Now, I'm not expecting that to actually add up to much, but the administration announced, and it was confirmed by China, that they've reached an accommodation on the imports of rare earth minerals and the magnets derived from them. So that's progress on the trade front. But I really think that July 9th will come, and in fact, White House spokeswoman Carolyn Leavitt said yesterday, oh, well, that's not a critical deadline, right? So I think that we all can tell that basically we're going to end up about where we've been. There'll be some level of tariffs and they'll be fine. And if they just done it that way to begin with, then we wouldn't have had to deal with all this trouble. It'll still be bad for the economy, but just not as bad as it would have otherwise been. But we'll find out about all of these things. There will be additional international summits that will take place just because that's what happens internationally in the summertime. So in as much as those events are relevant, we'll recap some of them, depending on what else happens in the interim. So
our next pod will be on the 18th of July. Yeah. So everybody enjoy your time off in the interim. He's Sam. I'm John. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, everybody.